Well, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and whether you're joining us live in person, online at stbarts.org, or here on Park Avenue, it is my joy and delight to welcome you to the forum where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. And on this fifth Sunday in Lent, the final Sunday in Lent before Holy Week, we are finishing our Lenten series on self-reflection with a discussion about the connection between self-reflection and psychotherapy. And we're very glad to have with us our own Dr. Trish Tidwell, who is a psychotherapist in private practice. Many of you may recognize her as one of our head ushers on a Sunday morning, but she's here in a different capacity this morning to talk about what she does professionally and how that helps so many people achieve some semblance of self-reflection. Trish, thank you so much. This is your third appearance at the forum, I believe, and it's great to have you back.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm delighted to see so many friends that I see in a different capacity coming here today. And I get to talk about one of my very favorite things, which is psychotherapy. I've been a therapist for 30 years, and it really is, for me, a vocation, not just a job. When I saw what this series was going to be about, and it started with Taylor Swift, I was kind of confused. I mean, why are we talking about Taylor Swift? And I had a little bit of an issue with I'm the problem, it's me. You know, I spend a lot of time in therapy helping people understand that they are, in fact, not the problem. So here we're going to talk about that. But what I came to understand was that she has gone up and down, death and rebirth several times in her career. And how did that happen? My guess is through a lot of self-reflection. The best part about self-reflection in situations like that is it means that you can identify the things that you can change, because we can change ourselves. We can't change other people, the environment necessarily, or some of the other things going on in the world. It gives us really the ability to regroup in so many ways. Okay. Our experiences are really made up of so many different things, not just thoughts, but our emotions, our physical sensations. And if we use self-reflection in its complete way, we're focusing on all of those things. It gives us a much deeper understanding of ourselves and helps us connect to traits, abilities, talents, beliefs, roles and relationships, things we don't usually spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think it's really important and so gratifying to be able to think about one's abilities, talents, and traits, because those are the things we sometimes sort of gloss over. Doing this helps influence our mood, our judgment, and our behavioral patterns. We make much more informed decisions because we're able to look at it and say, okay, these are the facts, these are the things I think about, these are the judgments I have about my thoughts, and these are my feelings, and these are the judgments I have about my feelings. It's a very thorough self-examination. And lastly, it gives us a greater sense of control. There's so much in life we can't control, but when we have all of this information that we carry with us internally, we have a much better chance of being able to control our own outcomes. Where am I going to go? Taylor Swift is a really good example. So then, the idea, you can do this on your own for sure. You can meditate. You can do journaling. A 15-minute a day process of journaling can help with self-reflection. And especially if you're doing it regularly, it means that you can see how things develop in your life. You can see your own patterns. I think my mic is going in and out. Or am I turning my head?
It's going a little bit.
Okay.
I think you can forward.
Okay. But therapy can help with self-judgment because it's really a collaboration. It's not advice. It's not directions necessarily. There may be suggestions, but the idea is really that it's a partnership. This can offer affirmation and validation, becomes a very powerful witness to your thoughts and change. And it can facilitate the process by asking questions, making observations, noticing things that you might not notice yourself. So I thought about 3 different kinds of psychotherapy. The first one is very popular. It's called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. It's short-term, tends to be fast, and really addresses specific problems or issues. The idea is that if you think about and explore how you think and feel in the here and now, it will help you change your thinking process. Sessions are very structured. There's specific issues. You have homework to do. You have forms to fill out. And their ideas to develop solutions to meet goals. The therapist uses Socratic questions to challenge irrational thoughts. Socratic questions like, what evidence do you have for this? What are the alternative meanings? And if this was happening to someone you knew, what would you think? What would you tell them? It helps move from a negative mindset to a positive one. Here's an example. Somebody comes in and they say, nobody likes me. Well, what evidence do you have for that? Well, I was walking down the street and I passed a friend and they didn't acknowledge me. They must not like me. They must be mad at me. So what's the evidence for that? Well, they didn't acknowledge me. There was no response. Any other possibilities? Nope, that's it. Well, what might be going on for them? Well, maybe they need glasses. Maybe they didn't see me. Anything else? Maybe they were preoccupied. Maybe they were thinking about something else. Maybe they were going over their grocery list. If a friend came to you with this issue, what would you think? Well, I might think that maybe the friend didn't know what was going on for the other person. Well, that's true. How can we know what's going on for someone else? The idea is that the outcome of that session, the person no longer feels that this person, at least, at any rate, doesn't like them. And maybe even makes a phone call or an email or a personal connection just to see how they are and to get some sort of validation to the problem. So we're going from a very structured, short-term therapy to one that is just the opposite. Psychodynamics theory, or psychoanalysis, is really based on looking at past, what patterns have developed, and how does that influence your present-day thinking and behavior. It's not structured. It's free association. It's wherever your mind takes you. It loosens the hold of controlling thoughts. The idea of free association is that it gives space for free mind wandering without self-judgment. It looks at ideas, thoughts, imagination, repeating patterns, symbols, memories, and leads to clues of self-understanding that help you make connections. The idea is that the present is shaped by the past, that the meanings of the past experience are held in the unconscious, which influences thoughts, feelings, and behavior in the present. The therapist helps you consider patterns and beliefs around the different areas in your life. Different psychoanalytic theories shape the therapist's understanding of experience. Freud died about 80 years ago, and things have moved on since he is no longer with us, which means that people have taken some of his ideas and used them to shape new directions. I think that's a good thing. Freud was a man of the 19th century and had some views that we might object to now. So moving on is a good idea. And the different theoretical perspectives and choices give you options in terms of who you might want to work with if you're going to choose this method. Ultimately, it gives you a better understanding of how you think and feel. And again, this means that you have choices, and more informed choices, and more control over how you feel, how you are in the world, and a much better of other people and what their motivations might be. Okay. Then we're going to talk specifically about self-reflection. The third is narrative therapy. This is the idea here is that you write, edit, and rewrite your own story from the beginning to the end. It could be about a specific piece of information, but frequently it's about your entire life story. Continuity in life. And the idea of editing it means you can give it different perspectives. It helps challenge old beliefs, problematic stories, gives you a reassessment, and an expanded view of yourself to open new ways of being. You can create a lens with which you want to see the world and how you want to see yourself. It's about what you can and can't do. Thanks. One sec. Is this on now? Okay. It's the idea is that you can look at what you can and can't do. It's how you expect to be treated and how you don't expect to be treated. When you change your narrative, it can change some of the expectations you have in the world. It allows you to reassess what's going on in life and what has happened in the past. In the narrative, some of the editing questions are, what's missing from your story? What do you wish had happened instead? Which part is fact? Which part is emotion? And how are the emotions changing the way I see the facts? How are the emotions obstacles? Because the thing is, we also have feelings about our feelings, right? A lot of us are brought up and raised that we should not be angry. So if we feel anger, we often feel ashamed. And then you feel shame about the shame, and it can get into a vicious circle. This type of process can help alleviate that. That you have a story of how did it get to be that anger is a problem? What's the shame about? And the relief from shame is one of the most powerful experiences that one can have in psychotherapy. And it's actually, I think, the most important piece of the work that we do. There are many, many other kinds of therapy, of course. I could go down the list, but I think that would take forever. But these are three that really focus on self-reflection in particular. Ultimately, going back to Taylor Swift, giving you the opportunity that you can evaluate where you are, how to get to where you're going, and what are the steps that you need to take to get there. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Trish, and I'm sorry for the audio issues, which some of you know is a common goblin at the forum. So we have plenty of time for questions. If Conrad Tinney is here and has question cards, if you have questions for Trish in the room, raise your hand and he'll bring them around to you to fill out and then come bring up to me. If you're joining us online, you can insert your questions into the live chat on YouTube, to the comments on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. Email also works if you're here in the room. This is a rare opportunity where you get to ask the therapist questions. The therapist is not asking you questions.
How often does that happen?
So, Trish, I wonder if we can start with what your advice might be for someone who is trying therapy for the first time, someone who's never done this before. What do they need to know, and how should they go about looking for a therapist and going about therapy with this new person?
Well, I would say the number one most important piece of information you need is, are you comfortable with this person? You can think about the various different ways that you might want to be considering how you want to do the work. You could do some research about different therapies. You could talk to friends who are in therapy, et cetera. You could talk to several different therapists. But most importantly is that you must feel comfortable with this person in order to feel that you can reveal and talk about some of the things that you may not talk to anybody else about.
I know that therapists in the past few years, ever since COVID started, have talked about kind of just incredibly full schedules. The fact that it's hard for people to get a new therapist. Therapists don't have openings. Is that still the case? And can you, as someone who does therapy in the heart of the city, can you speak to the demand that you see?
I would say therapists are still really busy. I think that the number of people looking for therapists is probably reduced. I know many people who are still full. Sometimes people have a waiting list. If you like that person and want to work with them, put your name on the waiting list. You never know how fast the waiting list is going to go. I think that I, for one, find it very frustrating that I don't have more time. I always wish that the day were longer, that I had more energy. I really don't like turning people away. It always makes me worry.
And Tricia, I think if you can turn the microphone a little more towards you, that'll help.
Okay.
Sorry again about all the audio.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit before about the mix between in-person and virtual therapy. How has that changed in the last few years?
Well, my goodness, before COVID, I had many colleagues who would never, ever think about having therapy with somebody on a computer, over the phone. If the person weren't in their office, it wasn't going to be happening. Obviously, that changed really quickly. Literally overnight in March of 2020, and it was remarkable. I had actually already been doing it because I'd had a number of people who traveled a lot for work and didn't want to miss their therapy. So I was already used to doing some online work. It's remarkable how it works, because in many ways it feels far more intimate than somebody being in my office. You see somebody essentially from here up. So it feels like you're very close to them. At the same time, you're not close to them. So for many people, that feels safer because I can't reach across and, grab them by the neck. Not that I would ever do that, but sometimes people worry about that. It's made therapy way more possible for some people who don't have the time to travel back and forth. I think about people with high-pressure jobs, but also parents of young children who don't have a lot of free time. This gives them an hour, right? They don't have to add in the travel time to and from. That said, there's some people who really prefer in person. My own practice is hybrid. I see people in person 1 day a week, and 4 days a week I'm working online.
A question that was submitted regarding narrative therapy. How often does the therapist challenge the patient's narrative, and how important is that to the process?
I think it probably depends on the therapist, the patient, and the narrative. I think it depends also on what we mean by challenge. I would never say to somebody, "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," right? Because the person's experience is their experience. I might say, "Can you tell me a little bit more about that moment? How did you get to that experience? I'm wondering if you can tell me what it is about that experience that makes you feel the way you're talking about it." I personally try not to use the question why, because that often sounds like too much of a challenge. Like, why did you do that? But that's my preference.
What's your approach if you think the patient is lying to themselves about an issue?
Well, I don't know that anybody really lies to themselves. I would think about it as maybe they're in denial about something, maybe they're have other concerns that override being able to see something clearly. We all want to stay attached to the people we love, for example. And sometimes that means that we don't see their flaws in the way that other people do. And sometimes that means that those are people that hurt us, and we don't acknowledge that that's what's happening.
Can you talk about the role of hypnosis in therapy? How much does that happen, and what function does it serve?
I think it's happening more and more. More people are becoming trained in hypnosis. I am not. But with the renewed focus on traumatic experience and the idea of being able to access a fuller experience, meaning your body sensations, or to be able to make those kinds of connections without getting sort of stuck up in the thinking, hypnosis can be helpful.
I know that you're trained in something called EMDR. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how that
Sure.
Functions in therapy?
This is my second favorite thing to talk about. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It is an experiential modality, which means that you have an experience that was developed in the 1980s to work with veterans from Vietnam. And the process helped them integrate information about some of the experiences they had so that it no longer felt present. The classic example is you're walking down the street and you hear a car backfire and you think, uh-oh, that's a bomb going off, and you dive under cover. The idea is that it helps you, it makes history, so that you hear the backfire and you may flinch still, but you get, oh, no, that's a car backfire. It reminds me of the fact that there were bombs going off, but it's no longer something that motivates me in the same way. People did that often enough with PTSD, and they discovered, hey, you don't have to be a vet to have PTSD. Maybe you've been in a car accident. So they began to use it for other experiences. And in the last 20 years, we've discovered that it actually helps where you get stuck. I can't help thinking about this thing. I'm stuck. I can't move forward. EMDR can unblock some of those experiences. We also have newer understandings or changed understandings about trauma. It's not just one big single event. It can be. But there are also little things that can be repeated patterns that influence the way you behave in the world that can make life more complicated. And EMDR can unpack that.
This is a question along the same lines as the denial that we talked about before. When a therapist thinks they understand the patient better than the patient understands themselves, how does the therapist work to help foster greater self-understanding in the patient?
Well, I think that therapist should come see me for supervision.
Say more.
Well, the patient's the expert on the patient, right? The therapist is an expert on how the mind works, and I think that the idea of a collaboration is to wonder about why the person is doing such and such, and wonder about why the person is not considering alternatives. But I don't go into anything thinking I know the person better than they do. I might have questions about it, but...
Yeah. Can you talk about the mechanisms of self-delusion, how we might not understand ourselves, what kind of gets in the way?
That's a very big question. I think that a lot of the time it has to do about emotional safety. and wanting to be able to function in the world in the best way possible. So I think that sometimes things get turned around. That person really didn't mean to do something, when in fact maybe they did. Or not being aware of what's going on in one's own psychic life or emotional experience, and acting on something that is not entirely true to the person.
We have a question about shame. Can you talk a little bit more about how therapy can help in releasing shame, and how much of a role that plays in your own practice?
Well, this is another one of those big questions. I think that shame is one of the most powerful emotions that we have in our emotional toolbox. A little bit of shame is not necessarily a bad thing, because it's kind of what keeps us in line socially. Like, oh, I'd be ashamed to interrupt somebody, so I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to wait for them to finish. But it's also the source of a tremendous amount of the loss of the experience of self-worth or self-esteem. It can be disempowering, and it can hold people back. That said, it's also can cause a great deal of anxiety. Sometimes it causes a great deal of anger. So it gets complicated. I personally work a lot with shame, because I think if you don't work with shame, you can't do the other work, because people feel ashamed about their feelings. Somebody will come in and they're depressed. You want to work around their depression, but they're ashamed that they're depressed. So unless you work with the shame, you can't get to the stuff that around depression.
A follow-up question about EMDR. Can you talk about how EMDR might be used for kind of re-entry after these COVID years we've been through, the kind of interaction between EMDR and coming back from COVID?
Well, coming back from COVID has a couple of different pieces. One has to do with the trauma of COVID, and the other has to do with how we lost some of our muscle memory. We lost some of our muscle memory of how to be with other people, how to assert ourselves with people, how to make friends. For some people, even just kind of like going outside, is it going to be okay? And in each one of those instances, EMDR could be very helpful. With the trauma of COVID, you want to look at what was the worst moment that you had in that moment. What was, and particularly people who were first responders or medical providers carry a lot of that trauma. The idea is that our memories are made up of thoughts, images, physical sensations, and emotions. And it's the idea of bringing all of those together and integrating them so that they can move through your system. When it's something about reentry, and the idea is, oh, I'm going to go to a party. I haven't been to a party in 5 years. I'm terrified. I'm feeling too shy. The idea is then to imagine what's going to be the worst thing that's going to happen at the party. And you set it up as if it's the same kind of trauma. And you work through it so the person can feel at least comfortable enough to go.
Can you talk about how we can measure therapy's effectiveness? How do we know that it's working?
Well, do you feel better? There are various different ways of measuring. Something like CBT, for example, is evidence-based therapy. That means that people have responded to questionnaires before therapy and then after therapy. But CBT is about a specific issue. I want to be able to speak comfortably in front of a crowd. So you work on that. And then the measurement is afterwards, were you comfortable? Yes. So there's a direct relationship there. With something like narrative therapy or psychoanalysis or psychodynamic therapy, it really is a question of Do you feel better? Has your life changed? Sometimes it's an internal experience, and there is no external evidence that it's going to be different. It's all about feeling more comfortable with yourself, maybe more comfortable with other people, more confident. Sometimes people on the outside don't see that.
Some people stay in therapy for years and years. There was a prominent journalist recently who did an episode, maybe you heard, on leaving therapy. How do you know when enough therapy is enough? And what do you think about the practice of folks staying in therapy for years and years and years?
I think that, first of all, there's always something to think about, always something to explore. I think we have infinite numbers of things to be exploring internally. So if you want to stay in therapy for 20 or 30 years, and why not? It's totally up to you. It's not the same as coming in and saying, okay, I'm going to solve this problem. I think that when the person feels confident that they will be sort of okay in the world, then they can leave. I know that if I'm not mistaken, that article was about how the therapist didn't want the person to leave. That's a whole separate issue, which I think that people should be able to leave when they want to leave.
We still have some time for questions, so if you're in the room and you have questions, just raise your hand and Conrad will come around with the question cards. And you can also, again, insert your questions into the live chat on YouTube, the comments on Facebook, or online at stbarts.org. Trish, the affordability of therapy, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. In New York especially, it's very hard to find somebody who's in network. I'm sure that you all had that experience. You can't find a specialist of any kind in network. It's hard enough to find a doctor in network. It's possible, but they're going to be the people that are going to be the most full. If you're looking for something that's more affordable, there are great options here in New York. And that is because this is one of the places where professional therapists, people who are already licensed, come to get additional training. And those people often offer psychotherapy at a very reduced fee. You're working with somebody who is new in a particular modality. That does not mean they don't know how to be a therapist. Oftentimes, they're people who have been working for 20 or 30 years and just want to learn something new.
Can you talk about the popular portrayals of therapy? There's a series called Couples Therapy where you can kind of watch couples as they go through therapy. There was an HBO series called In Treatment, an Apple TV series, which I'm not remembering right now, about
I think it's called Shrink.
Shrinked, yeah. That talks about, it depicts a therapist who starts telling his patients what he really thinks.
Yep.
What do you think of these depictions of therapy in the kind of popular media? Are they accurate? Are they helpful to what you do?
I think that they're helpful in the sense that they make people curious. Sometimes therapists get a bad rap in things like that. Certainly the one that Apple does on shrinking was funny. I find it funny. The couples therapy, I actually know that therapist. She's a very good, very talented therapist. That said, I'm not really surprised that she chose to do a television show. I don't know that I like the idea of real therapy being televised. I find that personally problematic, but
yeah, there are some ethical issues involved, I would think.
Yeah. In Treatment, I couldn't watch because I didn't think the therapist was very good and it made me mad.
Can you talk about the relationship between faith and therapy? Clearly, you're a person of faith who shows up at church, so you don't see at least enough of a conflict to make you stop coming here. But Freud didn't think so highly of religion, for example. Jung did. Can you just talk about the relationship between what you do and what happens here?
Well, I can really, for myself, I think God is with me in the practice of my work all the time. I don't think I would be doing the therapy the way I do therapy if I didn't have faith. I think that there are things that change that I can't explain, things that happen between the therapist and the patient that are on a level that is not certainly not material, but things we can really put our finger on. I think there are meanings that get created that have to have influence by the divine.
You mentioned that therapists will charge a reduced rate. How do you go about asking for that?
Do you have a sliding scale?
The process of EMDR that you talked about, how does that help a person make history history?
Asking me a lot of big questions today. So, memories are made up of, as I said, thoughts, images, sometimes sights, smells, sounds, emotions, and we give them meaning. And oftentimes the meaning, for example, might be, even though the person is alive sitting in your office, I'm going to die. And that's a very scary experience. Part of what happens is we process information cognitively and implicitly. And in the implicit system, we have emotions and body sensations. When we have a traumatic experience, not all the information gets processed. Often what gets stuck is the stuff in the implicit system. Our culture, by its very nature, privileges cognitive experience. We're encouraged to talk about stuff, to put things into words, to analyze things, to come to conclusions. That's very helpful in many situations. But when you've had a very significant, frightening, or strong emotional experience, talking doesn't address it in the same way as allowing yourself to feel it and to notice, for example, where is it in your body? What is going on? So when I'm working with somebody, one of the questions I'll say is, what's happening in your body? I do that even when I'm not doing EMDR, but what's happening in your body? Because somebody might, I work with one person, for example, who clenches her fists. And I can look at it and say, so you're white knuckling it, what's happening? And it might be out of her awareness at the time. But when we draw attention to it, she can then say, oh, I'm feeling whatever, and move on. But by connecting the information on those two sides, the cognitive side and the implicit side, by integrating them, the memory moves ahead and it's not stuck in the system anymore.
It's fascinating stuff.
Yes, it is.
A number of follow-up questions to questions that have already been asked. One relates to the role that clergy play. Sometimes folks treat clergy as a kind of therapist, even though most clergy aren't trained like you all are. Can you talk about that dynamic and what may be good about that and what may be problematic? Clergy as a quasi-therapist.
Well, I think the idea of being able to talk to a clergy person about concerns is actually really important. I think that gives one perspective. It may be that the clergy person will actually suggest that the person see a therapist. I've known that that's happened. I think the whole idea of confession, of course, encourages the idea that you can say anything you want to your clergy person, and they'll have the answer.
Yeah, and I will just add that I have called you before when I've needed help in finding a therapist for someone, and the kind of general rule tends to be if someone comes to you more than 3 times about a specific issue, that's the time to refer. That's the way we're kind of trained.
Sounds like a good plan.
Yeah. Is there such a thing as over-dependence on a therapist, and how, as a clinician, do you wrestle with that?
Well, I think that is another one of those things where the answer is it kind of depends. What if you're working with a person who's never been able to rely on anybody? They might go a little bit too far in one direction because they've never had this, and here's this great opportunity, and it feels really good, somebody I can rely on. Things sort of self-correct after a while. There are also people who perhaps sort of like over-attach, and the therapist's job is to help them become more independent. And really, that's the goal of the treatment. The idea is that I'm trying to make myself obsolete.
What is the difference between shame and guilt? Another small question.
Interestingly, I can answer that one. Guilt is about something you've done. I put my recycling in the trash. I feel a little guilty about that. Shame is about you and about yourself, not about your actions. I don't like feeling angry, and I got angry this morning, and I'm really ashamed of that. Is an example.
Do patients ever get confused between shame and guilt, and how do you help them untangle that?
It happens all the time. It's not an unusual confusion at all. A lot of times what actually happens is the person says, I feel bad about this. And to be able to parse that and understand what bad actually means can sometimes take a while. Because shame is about, I got angry this morning means I'm a bad person. It's not just that I haven't followed the rules, it's like there's something intrinsic about anger that makes me bad. But guilt's very different. I did something that I shouldn't have done. It's actually easier to deal with that than it is with shame.
Can you talk about taking medication for mental health reasons and how that practice intersects with therapy?
Sure. Sometimes the symptoms that you are experiencing of anxiety or depression can be so overwhelming that it's hard to function. And sometimes that means you can't get out of bed in the morning, and sometimes that means that your mind's spinning a lot of the time. And medication is very helpful there. The rule of thumb is that these days that taking medication and having therapy together is the ideal way to address, for example, a significant depression. I don't prescribe medication. I'm not a medical provider. I will refer somebody usually to somebody who is. That said, a lot of times somebody's primary care physician will prescribe medication. It's not really a drawback, but caution to that is a primary care provider doesn't have all the latest information about different medications, interactions with other medications, and some of the nuances with this particular medication is really good with this particular symptom compared to that. And a pharmacologist or a psychiatrist does.
And do you advocate use of medication among your patients? Is there for any reason, would you suggest someone not be taking medication?
Well, if somebody really doesn't want to, I'm not going to insist. And sometimes people don't want to. Certainly not all the people I see take medication. Sometimes they don't need it.
We've been talking about self-reflection and the importance of therapy as a way to get to know yourself better. But is it possible that sometimes the focus on self is a little too much in intensity, and is narcissism a concern?
Narcissism is about sort of like it's not just the exclusion of others, but real narcissism is about the inability to consider somebody else's perspective. You know, when I'm working with somebody in therapy, I'm really interested in their own experience. But most people are coming to talk about their interactions with other people. So that does enter into it. And I might ask somebody, well, what do you think's going on for the other person? Sometimes people know, sometimes they don't, sometimes they haven't wondered that.
Do you have advice for us in how we interact with narcissists in our everyday life? How common is narcissism in the general population, and how do you deal with a narcissist?
Well, okay, so there's this spectrum, right? There's actually something that I would call healthy narcissism, and that is that you feel good about yourself, and that you're confident, and that you know you should be treated well. And then there's this other end that goes all the way down to really somebody who's almost like a sociopath, because it's kind of like that's all they're thinking about. They're not feeling, they don't care about anybody else. So there's this spectrum in between. But most of the time, a narcissist is not thinking about anybody but themselves. And it's important to keep that in mind. They're not thinking about you. I was talking to somebody yesterday who had been very hurt by a family member who is a narcissist, and kept trying to figure out a way to make this person be nice to them. And tried being really, really polite, tried giving gifts, tried all this other stuff, and it was finally kind of like they had to get the idea that the other person was going to be a narcissist. It didn't matter what they did. And it's essentially, it's kind of like it's not about you.
So we're coming to an end. One final question I'll fit in there, and it's another small question for you. When you think about how we as a country, as a society, are treating mental health, what are your hopes for the future? How can we kind of collectively as a community better care for one another's minds and emotional lives?
Well, I obviously think that therapy is a good thing. I would hope that one of the things that would happen is, number one, that the stigma around getting help around emotional or psychological problems would be reduced. I think that's on its way with a lot of the sort of online or apps for psychotherapy. I don't know how good the treatment is, but the idea is at least it's out there and it's no longer a thing that you shouldn't be thinking about. I think kindness goes a long way. And I think that the more we can help each other learn to be more empathic and compassionate and kind, the better our mental health will be.
Trish, thank you so much. An important and needed conversation. Thank you all for being here. I hope you'll stick around and join us for worship at 11 a.m., whether you're here in person or online. The forum will be on hiatus for the next 3 weeks because we have a few things happening in the church's life. Holy Week and Easter. We'll be back on Sunday, April 7th, the second Sunday of Easter, with Jeffrey Dauma, who's professor of choral conducting at Yale University, ahead of a big performance of Britain's War Requiem here later that evening. So come back at 10 a.m. on Sunday, April 7th. In the meantime, blessed Holy Week to all of you and happy Easter.